who've taken their time in the last 2 weeks to share their thoughts on the state of the nation. Mr. Speaker, this was a unique opportunity presented to the House to speak and speak as candidly as I could, Mr. Speaker, on the various challenges that have been brought to fore by many citizens that have spoken the last few days on the state of our nation and the need for us as a leadership to respond to all that they have been addressing themselves to. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, from the onset, I thank all the close to, I think, 60 senators have so far spoken to this motion and shared their thoughts and ideas on how we can progress forward as a republic, which is extremely important, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd wish to perhaps set some disclaimers from the onset. Number one is that we are under no illusion that as a House we can resolve everything that we are being asked to resolve as a leadership of a country. Number two is that it is not everything that can be addressed immediately. But listening to most colleagues, Mr. Speaker, they divided their proposed solution almost into three parts. There are those that are immediate, there are those that are for the medium term, and there are those that are for the long term, Mr. Speaker, insofar as fostering a prosperous nation is concerned. And that's the nature of life. It's impossible, Mr. Speaker, to achieve change or the absolucy of, Mr. Speaker, a prosperous society in one instance. But there must be a beginning. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that this is a good beginning. This is where we want to start, Mr. Speaker, because it begins with an appreciation that we are at fault and there are things that we need to set right. Various leaders, Mr. Speaker, have since added their voice on how the nation can walk itself out of the crisis that we find themselves in. I have, for example, seen, Mr. Speaker, and it would make sense to confess this, that when we sat as a leadership to consult on the bipartisan nature of this motion, the leadership from the minority side asked us to take the preconditions for engagement that had been listed by the leader of the Azimio coalition, Mr. Speaker, in good stride and appreciate that he means well for the nation. And he feels that taking into consideration the things that have so far now been listed as amended in the amended motion, compensation of victims, acceptance and acknowledgement that their lives have been lost unnecessarily, persecution of those that have been involved in brutality, and so on and so forth, will be a good place to start. And I want to appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that that has made its way finally into the motion. Then subsequently, there are things that we'll have to do. And let nobody be under the illusion that it will be an easy journey, Mr. Speaker. If you have been involved in leadership, Mr. Speaker, I think, I'm not certain who spoke these words, but they said if you want to please everybody, don't get involved in leadership. Sell ice cream. That's the only job that you can do on earth and everybody will be happy with you. But so long as you're in leadership, there are certain difficult decisions that sometimes you'll have to make and not everybody will appreciate and celebrate you for. But the job has to be done. That job, Mr. Speaker, has befallen on us as 67 senators in this House, Mr. Speaker. We have a duty, and there's something that we can do, Mr. Speaker, to right the wrongs of the last 60 years in this republic. Mr. Speaker, we also appreciate and we know that on our own, first of all, being one of the unicameral units, of the bicameral units of Parliament in this House, Mr. Speaker, that we need our colleagues in the National Assembly to support us as well. Because the truth of the matter, much as when many of our colleagues were speaking, they may have cast aspersions and said certain things about the National Assembly, a legislation that has been passed by Senate alone is only good ink on paper. It cannot be law. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the National Assembly remains to be an integral partner, Mr. Speaker, especially in resolving issues that we have been addressed and that we are aware that can only be solved through the legislative arm of government, Mr. Speaker. There are certain laws that we will need to change. There are things that we need to tighten, Mr. Speaker. There are laws that we need to amend. We will have to work with our colleagues from the National Assembly. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, if you follow what we have done, first of all, in the first part of the motion, Mr. Speaker, is the preconditions that I have spoken to. You know about the National Police Service acknowledging and apologizing for the deaths, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is issue of compensation for the peaceful protesters, those that were involved in the 2023 protests that were led by the Azimio coalition. and the 2024 protests, Mr. Speaker, that were led by other Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, there is need for compensation, and this is what the House is resolving this morning to call upon the national government to do. There is also the need for the National Police Service to extend amnesty, but I must be very clear about this. The amnesty is to the peaceful protesters, Mr. Speaker, not the criminals that have been breaking into people's businesses. If you've been arrested, you've been found with items that you looted out of someone's hard-earned sweat, Mr. Speaker, that's not the people that you are pleading the cause for, Mr. Speaker. We are very clear and particular that this is in regards to those that have been unlawfully detained, Mr. Speaker, or arrested and have court cases. We cannot direct the office of the Director of Public Prosecution, Mr. Speaker. That's why the language used is, we are calling upon them in the spirit of, Mr. Speaker, setting a good climate for engagement as a country, Mr. Speaker, if they can consider, and we will be urging our colleagues in Justice and Legal Affairs Committee, because they are the line committee that engages that department, Mr. Speaker, to engage with them and ask them to withdraw the cases of those Kenyans that they are specific and they are particular, that their only crime and offense, Mr. Speaker, is a participated, you know how police draft these charges. They cannot say you are idling and doing those things, but amongst themselves, they know the truth, Mr. Speaker, that this person was just caught at the wrong place and at the wrong time, Mr. Speaker. That's why we are sending. We have a call to IPOA, the Independent Police Oversight Authority, Mr. Speaker. This is with regards to investigations of citizens, Mr. Speaker, that have lost their lives in the course of this protest, Mr. Speaker. None other than the President has given a public commitment, Mr. Speaker, to urge that there be speedy investigations and conclusions of those cases so that Kenyans can know, Mr. Speaker, so that we are given a blow-by-blow account of Kenyan X, how they lost their life, and this is what happened, why, and so on and so forth, Mr. Speaker, so that the truth can be known with regards to these particular issues, Mr. Speaker. I mean, it's part of the de-escalation efforts, Mr. Speaker, so that citizens can feel that their colleagues who lost their life, this was not in vain, Mr. Speaker. We have further spoken, and this is later in the comments. There are police officers, Mr. Speaker, who have also lost their lives in the course of this protest. I was just informed this morning by the Senator for Nyeri that last week, during the protest in Karatina, there is a police woman, I think, who was attacked, and she later succumbed to injuries, and so many others across the country. There needs to be explanation and account of all these people, Mr. Speaker, so that the country can have closure, Mr. Speaker. Parliament, and this is extremely important, Mr. Speaker, we are being asked as Parliament to put in place guidelines on actualization of Article 37 of the Constitution with respect to how citizens can enjoy their right to picket without resulting in the loss of life or property. Mr. Speaker, how comes in other jurisdictions, other societies, people are able to picket and enjoy their right to protest, Mr. Speaker, without necessarily resulting in loss of life or property, Mr. Speaker? Is it that we cannot have peaceful protests in this country? None other than the High Court has asked Parliament, Mr. Speaker, that you need to enact legislation that gives life, Mr. Speaker, to the enjoyment of these freedoms. And it is not about curtailing the rights of anybody to protest, because that's the sense I get many times when we speak about this. It is just about the need to ensure that those who want to picket, those who want to protest, Mr. Speaker, are able to enjoy their rights unhinged, Mr. Speaker. It is also about ensuring that when we have protests, we don't have a ghost town like we had yesterday. There are other Kenyans, Mr. Speaker. We don't want to set a culture where people fight against the provisions of Article 37 because they imagine that every time somebody writes a letter and says they want to protest, it means that it interferes with their businesses, Mr. Speaker. That is our duty, and we cannot run away from that responsibility as Parliament, Mr. Speaker. We must provide the necessary legislation so that in the same way, Mr. Speaker, in other countries, for example, and this not necessarily must be the case, but I'm just citing an example, that if you go to other cities, Mr. Speaker, they have provided lanes or parks, Mr. Speaker, where people express their dissatisfaction, or ways in which this can be achieved. The truth of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that this needs to be done. Members of the public, for example, those that had said they wanted to occupy Parliament, and I said this in my moving notes when I was speaking to this motion, Mr. Speaker, that if we had provided this legislation, Mr. Speaker, then it would have been possible for us at that particular time to hear from them and say, Parliament is an institution of the people of Kenya. If you want to petition this institution, if you want to engage, what is the process? How do you want to do it? Do you want the speakers to come and receive you? Do you want the leadership so that you come and present your petition? I have seen, for example, Mr. Speaker, a flyer this morning where they are saying they want yesterday, on the 25th, which marks exactly 1 month, and that is tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, to come to Parliament and, I don't know, have a remembrance of the colleagues that they lost. Mr. Speaker, the challenge that we have, though, and we must be candid with ourselves, is that the form and the nature that the protests have taken, Mr. Speaker, is that they have been infiltrated by people who have ulterior motives, Mr. Speaker, and are looking for an opportunity either to loot or do this or the other. Therefore, in the absence of either a leader or a team that takes responsibility and that provides the information and says, this is what we want to do on such and such a day, sometimes either police over-prepare, overreact, and we lose it all, Mr. Speaker. It will make more sense today, Mr. Speaker, if either your office or that of the leadership was to get this request written and said, this is what we want to do. And therefore, we all engage and say, let's be open and candid about ourselves. There is no harm, Mr. Speaker, in those people coming, laying the flowers the way they wish, and having an acknowledgement, Mr. Speaker, of what happened here on the 25th. The only challenge which I want to speak about, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that in the absence of either an organization or individuals to engage so that you appreciate and understand the form in which this has to be commemorated, so that you are able to separate those that intentionally, Mr. Speaker, want to come and do a commemoration, separate them from those that the criminals that have been taking advantage of this protest, Mr. Speaker, to harm other Kenyans, then we are in a difficult situation. And this is a challenge that we continue to face as a country. And until we're able to resolve that question, Mr. Speaker, perhaps you need to provide guidance. It is my sincere hope that even in listening to the Senate this morning as we bring closure to this motion, Mr. Speaker, the organizers will be pleased to reach out to your office and that of your counterpart, the Speaker of the National Assembly, so that we can provide guidance and open the gates of this house. Let people come in. Let them even see the damage that was done, to appreciate that it is not that Parliament did not take a hit, Mr. Speaker, that in the absence of proper guidance on how to petition Parliament, then you have the kind of damage that was done here. That, Mr. Speaker, and there's many other things that come to mind when I think about what happened on the 25th, Mr. Speaker, and the lives that were lost, including protesters and criminals as well, Mr. Speaker. It is important for the record to point out, because I know that perhaps this hasn't been spoken about in length, but amongst, for example, anyway, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to take a lot of time on that particular topic because I see the yellow light is on. Allow me just in concluding, Mr. Speaker, to speak to what is it that we are asking of each of our committees. We are asking the Committee on Budget and Finance, Mr. Speaker, and I know their colleagues, including, I think, Senator Osotsi and others that had spoken and said, why don't we allow the Office of Auditor General to carry out this audit for us? But I want to point them to Article 214 of our Constitution on public debt, Mr. Speaker. That is our primary responsibility, Mr. Speaker. It is us that does the approval, Mr. Speaker, of this public debt. And there is nothing that stops us from calling for the books and ensuring that even what is captured in the books of the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, as well as what the Treasury submits to Parliament, are in agreement. Mr. Speaker, all we are asking our Budget and Finance Committee is, first of all, to verify and ensure that there is an accurate record of what is our debt status as a nation up to this point. Then go further, Mr. Speaker, and establish which are these organizations or countries, Mr. Speaker, in the form of sovereign debt that we owe. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, so that we know which are these countries or institutions that we owe these funds and what was achieved with those funds, Mr. Speaker. We know for a fact that in the audit report of 2015, then Auditor General Edward Ouko pointed out that there might be a possibility that some of the proceeds of the first Eurobond never made it to the country, Mr. Speaker. Those are facts which only Parliament can establish, and that's why I want to urge our Budget and Finance Committee to take that assignment seriously, so that we have a complete audit. There is a very important exercise that we have asked them to do. Remember, last year, Mr. Speaker, we passed a law that by 2027, our debt to GDP ratio needs to be at 55%. We are now at 61%, Mr. Speaker. But we did not provide the roadmap of how to achieve that. I will not be surprised, Mr. Speaker, that we will gather again in this House in 2027 and realize that perhaps even that debt has grown beyond the 61%. Therefore, it is upon our colleagues who are in Budget and Finance Committee, Mr. Speaker, to tighten the noose and guide this House. And there is only one way of achieving it, Mr. Speaker. You must put a cap on the fiscal deficit that is allowed on the national budget, Mr. Speaker, year on year, from 2024 now all the way to 2027, for us to be able to achieve this 55%. It is something that you can mathematically arrive at. And therefore, our Budget and Finance Committee must lead us to amend Section 52C of the Public Finance Management Act even further, so that we set a cap limit of fiscal deficit year on year. Mr. Speaker, the reason the country is in this crisis, part and to a larger extent, is because of our debt challenges that has forced government to either borrow or eventually, Mr. Speaker, or raise taxes, Mr. Speaker. And you know where this has found us. The Standing Committee on Justice and Legal Affairs, Mr. Speaker, also has some serious work to do. Number one is a repeal of the Section 2 and 12A of the National Government Administration Laws. This is with regard to Chief Administrative Secretaries, as a sign of goodwill, because we have said we want to have a lean and inexpensive government, Mr. Speaker. They also need to establish the legal mechanism, Mr. Speaker, for merger of parastatals and state agencies that perform duplicate functions with a view to achieving a lean government. You know, Mr. Speaker, when the President addressed the nation about 2 weeks ago, he pointed out to the fact that about 47, I think, state agencies needs to be merged as an effort
including members of the public, and consider on the following issues. A, public debt and public finance management. The Standing Committee on Finance and Budget, 1, in